Thank you, Karen. As she said, I'm Peter Cronkleton from C4. I'm going to be presenting some work that I've been doing with a couple of my colleagues, Ann Larson and Ileana Montoroso, which is part of a global comparative study that we're doing on tenure and property rights. This particular work draws on a lot of the past things that we had been doing that weren't directly focused on tenure, but had implications for tenure research. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about is why Latin America stands out often when people talk about tenure and property rights. And one reason is, as you can see, this is that very famous diagram from RRI that shows land that's been transferred to the control or has been made the property of local people. And you can see Latin America, compared to both Asia and Africa, is much advanced in terms of titling land in favor of rural people, forest people, and or transferring the rights to manage and control forests. However, this number, that's very admirable. It's impressive, actually, when you go to Latin America and you see the level of devolution of rights. However, there's a great deal of complexity in these areas, and there's also a continued risk of pushback or these rights that are transferred being undercut in different ways so that people actually can't take advantage of them. So I'm going to try to point out three different issues here. One of them is in consolidating these rights, there's often this issue of adapting to the new rights framework that's set up by the reforms that transfer the rights. There's the issue of dealing with external pressures and changing policy over time, because many of these things have existed for more than a decade. They've gone through different types of shifts and different types of drivers that are affecting them, but also changes politically in these countries that make it difficult for people to maintain what they've gained. And then finally, this issue of adjusting to co-management arrangements. Many of these systems, because forests are considered national patrimony, rather than transferring full management rights to communities, they're partially transferred. And communities, if they want to exploit forest resources or manage commercially, in particular, forest resources, they're required to comply with different regulations by the state and report back to the state what it is they're doing. So I'm going to be drawing comparisons just on the Peruvian and Bolivian Amazon. And there are two types of models that predominate in these areas. There are property rights that are based on ancestral claims. These are primarily given to indigenous people. If you look in Brazil, you also have Afro-descendant people. It's also a very big deal in Colombia. But there are also claims that are based on livelihoods demands. The extractive communities. In Brazil, rubber tappers were quite famous. Many of the people in these areas in the south of Peru and the north of Bolivia depend on Brazil nut extraction. So I'll be comparing indigenous peoples in both countries and Brazil nut gatherers in both countries. And these comparisons illustrate variation but also key similarities. Generally, the properties granted to these types of actors are relatively large compared to others. But the reforms were only partial. They were granted access rights usually and exclusion rights for these areas, but almost never alienation rights, the right to transfer the rights to other people. That doesn't mean that people don't do this, but generally those transactions aren't legal. But very importantly, the management rights that are granted to these people are generally creating co-management systems, which can function under the right circumstances, but in many of the cases I'm going to talk about now, these are dysfunctional systems. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So first, I'm just going to introduce basically an overview of the types of reforms that created indigenous properties in the two countries, not going into much detail because of the time limitation. In Bolivia, in the 1990s, they created, after a series of marches, they created territorios comunitarios de origen, a type of indigenous property, not legally a territory because the Bolivian government didn't want to give that level of autonomy, but created properties that were the rights of indigenous peoples. These were often large, multi-community sites and frequently were multi-ethnic. And so they agglomerated large numbers of people and massive territories. In the Bolivian Amazon, there were 38 TCOs covering over 10 million hectares. There's actually about 70 TCOs in all of the country. And these rights were generally inalienable, indivisible, non-reversible, collective, non-mortgageable, and tax-exempt. It's a fairly standard construction that's granted to these types of rights, basically giving a certain level of autonomy to people that live in these areas, creating this special category. In Peru, they also created collective properties. There's a much longer history of these. However, these are often based on individual community areas. The most recent information from IBC and IDECEP shows that in the Amazon there were 1,000, almost 2,000 of these communities and almost another 1,000 pending. No new property rights have been granted to indigenous communities since 2008. These reach almost 10 million hectares, and then there's another 8 million pending. There's also a category of areas called indigenous reserves, which are areas that are considered co-management areas that indigenous people supposedly have access to and not other actors. One of the changes, critical changes that took place in Peru, while they title these areas for indigenous people, they explicitly do not give rights over forests. Forests are only granted as cesión en uso, or which is a type of usufruct right. And this is one key distinction between Peru and Bolivia, but in practice it's not as dramatic in the way people use forests. Brazil nut properties are quite different. In the north of Bolivia, you have a series where they created communal properties after a series of marches by Brazil nut communities that were being excluded from rights. The government was going through a process of titling large areas to the former terratenientes, the people that were barraqueros in the region, that were going to control most of the forests. And after a series of marches, they won the right to get communal areas using an equation of roughly 500 hectares per family, which is estimated as more or less what an extractivist area would use in the forest, anywhere between 300 to 600 hectares. As a result of that, these rights that are granted are very similar to the rights granted to TCOs in practice. They create an outer polygon, and within the polygon they allow people to use the customary practices to divide access to resources and create divisions and make decisions. In just the Department of Pando, there are 159 of these communities. Actually, today it's about 170 properties, but at the time we did this research, and over 2 million hectares of forest have been titled to these people. It's a substantial area of Pando, and it's the primary areas where some of the richest Brazil nut forests are located. In Peru, it was a different process. In the late 2000s, there was a decision to actually create individual concession models and not grant full property rights. And initially, the government was going to open this up to a public competition to allow people to bid for the rights to these concessions. But marches and protests by Brazil nut gatherers in the region forced the government basically to recognize the acquired rights of Brazil nut gatherers as long as they complied with the concession process and were deemed eligible to gain the concession. As a result, just over 1,000 concessions were granted for almost 1 million hectares. In general, the two situations between Bolivia and Peru, you notice that in Bolivia there's a tendency to aggregate very large areas into a smaller number of properties, where in Peru you have a fractioning of these areas into many more small locations. And in the case of Brazil nuts, into individual producer areas. So I'm going to now go back to these issues that people have to deal with in consolidating their properties. So the first one I want to talk about is just this idea of needing to adapt to novel property frameworks. And one of them is the need to develop new institutions, thinking of institutions in much the same way that Catherine was talking about it, that these are the rules and decision-making processes that take place. And in the case of Brazil nut gatherers in the north of Bolivia, they were required to form communities. These are situations where you had individual families that had livelihood systems that were largely based on individual household labor, that establish individual negotiations either with merchants or with former landowners, and have a very individualized organization. However, to qualify for titling, they had to consolidate and register as communities. And once that happened, they were allowed to then submit a demand and go through a process to have their territory demarcated. But this is a good example, this map in the top. This is a polygon of about 12,000 hectares of an individual community, but each of those colors represent the Brazil nut grove of a family, an individual family in that area. And so while it is a communal area, inside the polygon, it's a very, very fragmented, individualized area where people have very clear ideas of where their property begins and their neighbor's ends. And one of the things I'll come back to a little bit later is these polygons actually have a very difficult time matching up to these types of production systems. So you frequently find, when you look on the ground of where people's resources are really located, they're frequently outside of the polygon that's been titled to them. They're often needing to adapt to new regulations. So, for example, in the Peruvian case, when they created the concessions, while the new system followed many of the initial or mimicked many of the regulations that existed previously, they were required to conform to the new forestry law, develop management plans, and more than anything, follow a series of administrative requirements annually to maintain their rights to forests, which in this case created a situation where individual producers were very dependent on foresters, that forestry consultants that would sign their paperwork to validate that it was indeed valid, I guess. But although these forest contractors would not go to the forest, would not actually do any field work, they would simply go through a process of serving as sort of a rent seeker in this process. Finally, you had situations where you had these multi-community territories, which is the example of many of the TCOs in Bolivia. You had communities that had some relationship, but they often functioned as individual communities, and they found themselves conglomerated within large properties, often with other communities that were of different ethnic groups, and then were expected to govern and manage these territories collectively when there was no history and no secondary level organizations that could take on that role. It also required the creation of new authorities, and this is and Larson and I have a paper coming out that talks about this in World Development, that often in this process of titling areas and defining these polygons, states recognize certain types of authorities within communities that aren't necessarily the authorities recognized in these communities. We've done a lot of work, for example, in the TCO Guarayos, that in this case, the Guarayos TCO formed, or the Guarayo people formed a organization to pressure the government to participate in the marches to gain recognition of their land claim. So this was a pressure organization, basically a political entity that pressured the government. Once their TCO was recognized, the title was admitted in the name of Kopnak, this organization. So Kopnak was a representative organization for political lobbying, but was suddenly given the role of actually the government of the TCO, the Guarayos TCO, when there were no institutional structures set up for them to be a representative organization or to have any necessary skills or processes for managing their territory. Finally, you have boundaries often, since we're talking very large areas in often remote forested regions, you have boundaries that are nebulous, odd-shaped, or mismatched. And I want to give a few examples of that. This diagram here is actually the Guarayos TCO. Do I have is this a laser pointer? Sorry for the people on this side of the room. Does it show? Barely. This polygon here is the demand of the Guarayo people for their territory. The dark gray areas are the area that was eventually titled in their favor. And all of this area in the center is near the road. It's where almost all the population lives in this area. But most of this area that was titled is in the most remote area of Guarayos, that it's almost impossible to visit these areas. It's several hours traveling on dirt roads through the forest to get into these areas. So you go out there, it's very little indication of when you're in the TCO and when you leave it. So there's no real indication of that. And often you go to these areas and you can find ranches or other people claiming these areas, and there's always a dispute among the people in these areas where the boundary ends and where it begins, because it's usually only demarcated near settlements and near roads. Other examples. These are some of the Brazil nut communities in Pando. These were some of the more egregious examples that we could find. Now, if you see a satellite image, the gray areas are the areas that actually came out in the title to these individual communities. It looks more like an archipelago. If you talk to people in these communities, they perceive their community as being defined by landmarks in the terrain, different streams, different pasture areas, areas of natural grasslands that demarcate the division of their property from their neighbors or other properties. For whatever reason, even though the INRA, the land titling agency in Bolivia, was supposed to prioritize the property demands of Brazil nut gatherers, in practice, in the office, they took into account previous claims of landowners, ranchers, others, who may or may not have title, often did not have title, but were in the process. And because it was a non-transparent process, they would demarcate these areas in often really strange shapes. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could fence in these areas that are titled to these communities. And in fact, if you visit them, the families that live in these areas continue to gather Brazil nuts in all of these areas. They don't recognize that there are these divisions because there are no fence rows or no demarcation. And they assume, because they've been given title, and they'll often be given an 8 by 12 piece of paper with a map of their territory, but with only just georeference information, no landmarks, no other indication. People are really not sure where their boundaries are. And so they don't quite understand, in many cases, that what's been titled to them isn't actually the forest that they're using. And a good example of that is this community of Turicaratera in central Pando that we visited. And this community drew our attention because we were doing some activities with participatory mapping. And this polygon is the polygon that Turicaratera received. It's about 10,000 hectares. This is in the middle of the multi-ethnic TCO2 from Pando. And they were having a conflict because there's a creek that runs through their property, and to the north of them there's a Takana community, and traditionally the stream that ran across their property divided the Brazil nut groves of the community from the Brazil nut groves of the families living in the Takana community. When they learned that their majones, the boundary markers, were placed on the other side of the stream, they were unwilling to negotiate with the Takanas. They were like, no, sorry, they've drawn the line, you've lost your Brazil nut groves. And so we started doing the participatory mapping, and one of the first activities is we asked them to just sketch map their area. And then so they drew their polygon and placed all of their centros and trails inside the polygon. But then as part of the process, we trained them in basic cartography techniques. They went out and they mapped the area where their Brazil nut groves, and their Brazil nut groves are actually in this configuration. So they realized by taking a very hard stand and not negotiating about this difference in Brazil nut trees that they were gaining, they were actually going to lose all of these other areas of Brazil nut groves that were inside the Takana TCO. So what then happened once they learned this is they went back to their old Brazil nut groves, forgot about this area, and the community returned to business as usual. They do have 10,000 hectares of forest titled in their name. It just isn't the forest that they're using. And that is quite frequent. A number of communities have this problem, that they also went in a situation where they would title areas for communities, and because they would be eligible to receive 500 hectares per family, but particularly for communities near the capital, Cobija, there was not that much space available. So they would learn that the INRA had given them patches of forest on other sections of Pando, and in fact, these other areas were occupied by people. So they were granted title to areas, but no ability to really use them. The challenge then of responding to external pressures, I think this is well known. These are huge territories, low population densities, high percentages of forest, and often forests are viewed as unproductive, abandoned, and targeted for development. So the fact that they aren't occupying the land, it's seen as forest, and most people coming into the region or governments outside of the region see this as land that is not being used. Next. There's, for example, in Peru, a very famous incident when Alan Garcia issued a series of editorials in El Comercio talking about Aesop's fable of the dog in the manger, accusing indigenous people of sitting on resources, not using the resources, and not letting other people develop the resources, was part of a process to question why so much of the Amazon was being titled in favor of indigenous people. The case of the Tipnis area in the Chapari in Bolivia also is well known, of the Evo Morales government wanting to open up the territory for a road into the Beni, setting off major protests across that. But also the situation of overlapping rights granted to different groups. And this is a case of some work that we did with Andrea Chavez, where we took different agencies in Madre de Dios, maintained cadastres of property without comparing it to the other. So what this shows is the pink areas are all the Brazil nut concessions. These were granted by the Forest Agency in Peru, the regional or the National Forest Agency. But then the regional government, an agrarian agency, was able to title land. The dark purple areas are areas titled for agriculture, but the light blue areas are areas titled for agriculture that overlay Brazil nut concessions. Now, there's no uniform map shows these differences because they're maintained by different agencies. And when we showed this to people in the region, many Brazil nut producers were surprised to find out that people had received title to land that they were gathering Brazil nuts on, because this often takes place during political campaigns. So, and for political favors, titles are granted to people in return for votes or support. Finally, just very quickly, then, the challenge of adjusting to co-management regimes. This is what I mentioned earlier, that while people are granted rights over forests, they're very limited because they're required to comply with forestry laws, which isn't necessarily a problem. Co-management, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, are systems where you have multiple actors that negotiate to share key management functions, entitlements, responsibilities over an area or a resource. Usually you have people with responsibilities to manage and protect an area, and the government would then in turn grant them the rights to benefit from that area and protect those rights. Often they're dysfunctional, and there's another topic that's related to this, is the concept of sterile dualism that Onebon coined, which is a situation where we have the law that makes the state the main owner of a national resource is not operative, but at the same time the customary system that framed resource use behavior continue but are not legally recognized. So you create these catch-22 situations where people are protecting forests, but their work and management of forests is not recognized, and their attempts to benefit from that management can potentially bring down sanctions or other types of penalties under the law. You also have the lack of support of exclusion rights. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into these examples too much, but it's very frequent in both indigenous areas and in Brazil nut areas of people recognizing invaders moving into their forest land, denouncing these invasions to public agencies that don't respond or ask them to pay to have police come to the area or go to this area. But that's often ineffective. And then you'll often have other government agencies arrive and fine these producers for deforesting areas that are in the forest estate. So there's a situation where their rights aren't protected, but then they're held responsible for infractions committed by other people. Legal oversight falls on those that are obeying the law. This is a very well-known process of people trying to comply by doing management plans and finding that they are receiving the brunt of police actions to control forest use, while their neighbors or neighboring communities are not making any effort in allowing people to log in their land. And then the lack of coordination and contradictions or competitions between state agencies, which I've just sort of mentioned. So I want to just end with, rather than with conclusions, just some points to raise discussions. So historically, people have adapted, but when you have situations of accelerated change, it doesn't leave much space for the trial and error that normally takes place in processes of adaptation. So you have areas like the MAP region where the interoceanic highway is cutting through these areas where people are developing the institutions they need to govern these new properties. At the same time, there's a massive influx of other types of actors into these regions, and incentives and opportunities of outsiders to come in and try to benefit from this land. There's the question of, would transferring greater weight to the customary rights, should they transfer these rights if the states lack the capacity for enforcement? And a great example of this is one time talking to one of the directors of the Superintendencia Forestal in Bolivia. We were talking about sort of the chaos that was happening around the Guarayas region. And this man complained that because people were failing to respect the forestry law, it was causing massive deforestation, illegal logging, and forest degradation. And I mentioned, well, why don't you give more control to communities and let them to deal with this? And he said, well, we can't. And why? He said, well, if we did that, there would be massive deforestation, illegal logging, and forest degradation. So there's this situation where people recognize that it's not working, but they're unwilling to try to transfer rights or do something where more responsibility could be granted to local people. The prioritized enforcement to support granted rights rather than punishing minor infractions. It's often very easy for agencies to penalize very easily observed forestry infractions, but then the more difficult aspects like mediating conflicts or ensuring that, or making a decision favoring one group or another when you have two communities in dispute, people are unwilling to make politically tough decisions. So it's easy to focus on very cut and dried minor infractions. And also then there's a real need to streamline processes in the responsible agencies, unify rules, and improve communication among agencies, which is easier said than done. With that, I realize I'm running out of time, so thank you.